Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with James Fitzpatrick. Today, we will focus on markets and production in the Seghabe region and the Republic of Guinea, and explore current trends, production dynamics, and key market signals in the cashew sector. We are pleased to have special guest speakers from the sub-region who are joining us for today's session. They will bring diverse perspectives from across the Seghabe region. Jim will be introducing them shortly. But before then, this session is available in both French and English. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen. We are also streaming live on the official African Cashew Alliance Facebook page and YouTube channel. Feel free to follow us and share with your network. As always, the GMA is an interactive webinar. You are encouraged to ask questions and share your comments in the Q&A box. We will make time to discuss them during the session. The session is brought to you by the African Cashew Alliance with the support of the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Cashew Club, and Sustainable Nuts Initiative. We would like to specially invite you to the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana, from 15th to 18th September 2026. Take note of the date, 15th to 18th September 2026. Join hundreds of cashew stakeholders to network, share experiences, and discuss the future of the industry. Online registration is now open, and we invite you to visit www.africancashewalliance.com to secure your spot now. Good morning, Jim. How are you doing? Jim, kindly unmute.
Morning, Isaac. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you too?
Oh, good. Good morning, everyone. And you are welcome to our 98th session of Global Markets with Jim. You're all very welcome. And today, in a first time for this season, we have some guests with us, and I'm very pleased to welcome them. I'll introduce them in a moment. Let me fill you in on what we're going to do today. We'll start with a little bit of an overview of the market. And it's all about supply today. It's all about production. It's all about supply. We're going to look at production in the really big producing countries. And then we'll focus on our regional choice for today, which is Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and the Republic of Guinea. Really important area, really important at this time of year. I'll tell you a little bit about it. And then we're going to have a chat with our expert guests. We have today with us a panel of 4 guests. They are all in their own way pioneers in the cashew sector. We have John Rao. John is an exporter, trader, originally an engineer with an MBA, multi-commodity experience, has been around a while, good guy and a very good friend of this event. He's been with us before. So welcome, John, and thank you for joining us. Our second guest is from Senegal, a processor, Papa Eliman Dramé, the founder of SCPL, been processing, if I'm not wrong, I think over 20 years now, a pioneer in the business with an organic certification, which is really interesting. and he is also very welcome. Our third guest is from Republic of Guinea. He's been also with us before. Tierna Hamadou Balde is the Executive Secretary of the Cashew Interprofession in Guinea. Long experience in agriculture, consultant, a business person, a lot of things, and very valuable and very welcome this morning. Thank you for joining us. And our fourth guest is Amrit Kurian, who describes himself brilliantly, and I wish I had thought of this. He describes himself as the Chief Curiosity Officer of Comafrique, based in Banjul, in Gambia. A man who has, in a way, found an interesting way to both inform and entertain with his various posts and observations. And he's very welcome. We can rely on some real expertise from Amrit. So, for, as I say, pioneers, well qualified to talk to us on the subject of cashews in their countries. And what we'll do is we'll take an approach, question and answer, informal discussion. And participants, please feel free to raise your hands or put some questions into the chat. I'm sure our guests would be more than happy to answer those as we proceed through the conversation. But first, let's start with some general discussion of the market, some news, and we'll have a look at the overall picture. And I'll focus in, as I said, the theme this morning is about supply. So I'll focus in on the major producers before we go to our sub-region and that focus. Over the last 2 weeks, we haven't really changed the crop estimates. We've been looking closely at various countries, but our estimate remains relatively steady. Particularly interesting is the situation in Côte d'Ivoire, where they're waiting for a somewhat delayed second crop, but as we'll see, arrivals have been pretty good. Farm gate prices just about everywhere have been relatively steady, a little bit of movement up and down, but not too much over the past 2 weeks. It has been a relatively quiet period in terms of market volatility. International RCN prices are steady. I think this is a really interesting subject. How does the RCN price remain so strong compared to the kernels market? So this is something that we're going to have a look at in 2 weeks at the next Global Markets with Jim. And it's about market power, it's about cash flow, and it's about the structure of the sector. So that's something that I'll certainly be looking forward to researching on that. RCN imports, looking at the two major processing countries, India and Vietnam, ahead of last year, significantly ahead of last year in the case of Vietnam, which is interesting and probably indicative of the strength of production in East Africa in recent years. Kernels prices slightly lower. There's not really much movement on kernels prices. Maybe a little bit of nervousness from some processors in Vietnam. If you had sales to the Middle East, for example, you've got to replace those. But generally speaking, kernels price is steady. Interestingly, in Africa, particularly for the higher quality, more qualified suppliers, prices remain very strong. Still making significant premiums, still finding good demand, especially from the European market. If we look at the overall demand trend, well, it has been a little bit mixed, as you'd expect. We see good demand from the United States, maybe a little bit of catch-up going on there after some significantly disrupted periods, really all of 2025 and part of 2024. But big questions everywhere about the economic impact of the war in the Middle East, the ongoing restriction on oil supplies, the volatility of energy prices, and how that might affect demand as we go on through the year. We didn't expect that 2026 would be a year like last year, a bumper year in terms of growth, but we did expect it to be a fairly good year. We have events in the world of sport, the World Cup, for example, that will influence demand, particularly in Europe. We also have a really strong demand trend in China. But for now, that seems to have softened. And it really depends on the outcome of negotiations to end the war and hopefully reduce the cost of energy. I thought I should mention also, originally I hadn't planned to mention this, but I had look at some articles yesterday, and what I noticed is that the policy debate is still back and forth in Nigeria, the idea of banning the export of raw cashew nuts, and I don't know why anyone would want to do that, but that's the discussion. And less impactful and probably more organized in Burkina Faso, the discussion around about when the open export of raw cashew nuts can take place. They're operating a quota system. You have to supply processors. That to a certain extent restricts exports of raw cashew nuts, and certainly it restricts the free market movement. And that's an evolving situation, probably with good reason. Is a growing processing industry in Burkina, and it does need some support. So it's not been a particularly volatile period over the last 2 weeks, but it certainly has been interesting. Let's have a look at the supply side. So I'll look at the major countries. I'll have a quick look across West Africa, and then we'll talk to our guests. So let's look then, and we'll start in Asia, and we'll take a look at Cambodia, Vietnam, and India. So in Cambodia, despite some of the earlier discussions, exports are pretty healthy so far. It looks like we will have a longer harvest season due to the weather conditions, but exports ahead of last year, which is interesting. Last year's crop was said to be a little bit late, but in the end, well over 900,000 tons was exported to Vietnam to be processed there. And that could happen again this year. But I do think perhaps the crop, which last year was estimated at, I think it was 1.02 million tons. I think just looking at the trends in the weather, it could be 5 to 10% lower this year. That's not a big crisis by any means. And it's by no means certain that it will be lower. What we're looking at in Cambodia is maturing trees, even some new trees coming on stream versus the impact of the weather. So like most countries, Cambodia is highly exposed to the impact of climate change. Looking at Vietnam, again, the peak season of the harvest has passed. So Vietnam grows around about 320, 325,000 tons these days every year. Weather's dry, rain is forecast. Outlook remains for maybe a good, average good crop. Raw cashew nut prices still relatively high, but they have been softening in recent weeks as arrivals increase. And I think sometimes we have to look at Vietnam and Cambodia together when we talk about price. And prices at the moment reflect quality. There's a differential for what they call the traditional varieties in Cambodia, which gives us high quality but smaller nuts, and the new hybrid varieties, which give us these very large, very high yielding nuts. So relatively good position in those two countries. Between them, we're looking at something like 21% of world production on average. Looking at India, so the Indian crop has started. It's not in full flow, I would say. The forecast remains for a good crop. A good crop in India is about 780,000 tons. Estimates range up to 800,000 tons, but at this time of year, the estimates are not necessarily 100% accurate. There is a rainfall deficit, and just looking at the weather conditions, that could have an impact. It could mean that the crop goes on a little bit longer. And then, of course, when the monsoon arrives in India, that's usually the end of the harvest. So when it arrives, has an impact, and that might have a greater impact if the crop goes on a little bit longer. But it is early days. Prices at the farm gate and in the market suggest a relatively normal supply, processors being cautious and probably with good reason, as we will see. So let's focus then. We move to West Africa and we move to the world's largest producer of cashew nuts, Cote d'Ivoire. So what are we seeing? Well, it's interesting. Arrivals are actually slightly up on the same time last year, despite all the chat about a poor crop, despite all the gossip, the actual volume is slightly up. And that doesn't mean that the crop will be any bigger. It just means that at this point in time, we're there. So there is still a certain amount of risk. And it's interesting to note. So there's a couple of standout numbers. Arrivals well up there. These are figures from CCRK, the regulatory body. Processors purchases are way above last year. The 550 is the total purchases for last year. Reported by the CCRK is already 691,000 tons processed. That is extremely interesting, of course. So arrivals the same as last year. Quality is definitely an issue. Now, I don't think that the quality is particularly poor. I think that the quality is average, maybe just below average. We have to be careful when we measure these things. If we measure against last year, we should also recognize that last year was an excellent crop. Quality was very good last year. We were saying £50 in February and March last year. We don't usually see that. And what we see this year is a little bit more like typical average quality. But it is probably now at this point a little bit below average. And it does tend to fall as the season goes on. So overall, I think that the arrivals the same, quality a little bit below average, but the second crop is somewhat delayed. It is expected. Good sources are telling me that they do expect the second crop to arrive. They've observed flowering. They think that the crop could be a very long crop. It could go on into July. That means that the risk of damage to the crop, the difficulty drying, the impact on overall production yield is high. So much higher risk the later you go into the year. And this year we're into a later crop by the looks of it. But with almost 1 million tons already reported arrived, obviously the impact of that is relatively limited. Farm gate prices are steady, around about the minimum, 400 CFA, but higher in many areas, up to 450. That works for everyone, no question about it. I think processors would like a little bit lower price because they have seen a sharp increase in their costs. But generally speaking, this should work on prices, and export prices are steady. So we think that the crop will be much more like it'll be a good crop in terms of its volume, but it won't be as big as last year. Last year was I think it was 1.549 million tons. We think about 1.3 million tons this year. That is, by any measure, a really good crop in terms of volume. Okay, it's not a new record, but it's more than enough to supply the demand. I suspect also that the processors, with almost 700,000 tons bought, I suspect they may well resell some of that. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that quantity go for export. And it's kind of an interesting setup in terms of how does this relationship between buying for processing and buying for export work within the rules in Cote d'Ivoire. Longer drawn out harvest, and I think by the time we get to the end of the year, processing and kernels exports generally will be strongly up. It will be another pretty good year for developments in the country. Let's have a look at some of the other countries in West Africa. Nigeria. So we hear, and I'd like to just stress, thanks to our African Cashew Alliance market reporters, they have a network which contributes to the Africashew Splits, a fortnightly magazine for members, and some of this information is drawn from their contributions. So what we see right now is the weather has been a little bit mixed. We're told 150 to 200,000. I know it's a broad measure, but that's what they're telling us has been exported or is in the course of being exported. Processors bought about 50,000 tons. Again, I guess there is a little, it's difficult to judge what's bought for processing, what's bought for export, given that some of the same companies are engaged in both. Significant cross-border trade from Benin. Generally speaking, good signals. It's not going to be as big a crop as last year, but pretty good crop. If it hits 300,000 tons, that'll be an excellent crop for Nigeria. And of course, note also the quality in Nigeria is improving. Ghana coming to the end of its season. we're looking at a stabilization of the quality. The first crop was poor, or the first flush was poor. The second is much better in terms of its quality, but generally speaking, probably quality is at the lower end of the averages. In terms of volume, I think the crop is down on expectations and probably more likely a kind of a low end of average crop, but there were significant shortfalls in the early part of the season. Prices remain pretty steady in Ghana. In terms of quality, we would have to say those are pretty decent prices if you're talking about a lower quality product. In Benin, okay, we had some very aggressive early forecasts around about 200,000 tons. If you've attended this event before, you'll know we never really bought into that number. We think it's lower, but there is as an impact of the ban on the export of raw cashew nuts, processors are facing, I think, even more difficult competition from illegal export. So this can be done cheaper. It can be done apparently as needed because it's really difficult to enforce. And what would happen if it were enforced is an even bigger question. What would happen if farmers in Benin could not sell their raw cashew nuts? Probably long run, production would be severely negatively impacted. But with improved weather in the last couple of weeks, with competition for raw material, it seems likely that farmers will continue to harvest. Again, like other countries, we'll see a longer harvest, but I think this could end up around about what was originally expected, 150 to 160,000 tons. That will be exported probably through Nigeria. Hopefully, a significant volume will be processed. It's been mentioned that about 50,000 tons has been procured by processors. I do not have verification of that, but if it's true, it's about the same as last year. So we would hope that processing in Benin would improve this year in terms of volume. What about Burkina Faso? Well, the export remains restricted by the quota system. So this is a system in which exporters can procure raw nuts for export, but must supply processors with a proportion of that. That is an interesting approach. It's a little bit different to other countries. It means, in theory, if you supply the quota, you can then export. We were recently speaking to someone in Burkina who told us that about 70,000 tons had already been exported. But I think they also said that it could be May, it could be June before export, could be the end of May or it could be June before open exports happen. There has been significant investment in processing in Burkina, and this system is to give those processes a chance to develop. One problem this year has been that farm gate prices have been quite high, and that's caused processors some problems in their sourcing. So looking at this situation, I think overall across this eastern part of West Africa, we're going to look at the western part shortly, but in these countries, we are seeing a lot of talk about weather. We're seeing a lot of talk about a lower crop, but what we're actually seeing is a fairly good to average crop. It's not the bumper crop of 2025, but it is certainly of lower quality and lower outturn, and that can only be the impact of the weather. And perhaps it is a sign of things to come in the future as climate change takes hold. Now, interestingly, on climate change, it also means that more areas become suitable for growing cashew nuts. So, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, areas that are now known for cocoa may become areas that will become known for cashew nuts, expanding production, but not necessarily improving the quality or the yield per hectare. So, a significant impact of climate change in West Africa, but it could actually lead to more volume being produced, which is probably not really good news. So let's step back from Africa. Let's try and put this into the context of the world cashew production. And this is our calculation. So we've knocked back our estimates by about 1%, just under 1% in the last week. Generally speaking, reports are more optimistic. Those reports from West Africa, particularly, but also from Cambodia, more optimistic on the crop over the last 2 weeks. It can be a long, drawn out harvest. That leaves its own questions. But if we look at the volume, so what you're seeing here is the crop production history and a high estimate, our high estimate at just under 5.9 million tons this year worldwide, and the low estimate just under 5.5 million tons. And it's just put that in context. It's not as good as last year's crop for sure, but at the high and even at the low end, we're still looking at a second largest crop in history. So to talk about shortage is not really accurate. And this really does invite some questions around about the prices being asked for raw cashew nuts at the moment, not so much at the farm gate, but in the international market. So the questions for the coming weeks are: how will a wet harvest impact quality? How will a wet harvest impact the volume commercialized? And how will the long drawn out harvest impact farmer motivation in West Africa? Farmers may now be focused on other crops, they may be focused on food crops, they may be less motivated to collect the cashew nuts. Secondly, how does it impact cash flow? Does a long harvest impact cash flow? So bearing in mind that a lot of the raw cashew nuts, especially the export, is financed from outside the countries where it's produced, there are competing products looking for money. How will this impact the cash flow? And I suspect it's going to be rather tight. Now, if there's not enough cash in the market, it probably means lower prices. And the third question for the coming weeks is production in those areas that are now becoming very important coming on stream, the areas that we're going to talk about today. So moving on the supply situation, we've said the crop, volume-wise at least, doesn't look too bad. Let's look at the situation in the two big processing countries. Vietnam, first of all. So this is a profile of Vietnam's supply between January and the 15th of April this year. Imports up by 21% on last year, just over 1 million tons. A crop estimate around about 320,000 tons. Healthy opening stock. Burma imports and some afloat cargo, which are estimates. So this would suggest a reasonably good supply position at this moment in time. If we look on the demand side, we see exports at 745,000 tons in last year, it's not this year, but exports are up by about 3%, 745,000 tons of raw cashew nuts, equivalent. So that's up 3%. That's significantly up, given that for the month of March, the markets in the Middle East were entirely lost and that we have had so many questions around demand. But the return of the United States as a major buyer has largely offset the decline in the Middle East and a very soft opening to the market in China over the first 3 months of the year. So when we add it all up, there's about 5 months stock of raw cashew nuts. That's a calculated number. There's about 600,000 additional, there or thereabouts. It could be a little bit less, of course, available in Cambodia to be bought or being bought. That would mean that the Vietnamese processors, if they were to match last year's exports and to finish with the same stocks, would need an additional 2.14 million tons. The question, of course, in the coming months is, will that be available? And looking at production side, the answer is probably yes. There will be continued doubts on demand, and that will cause nervousness amongst processors until the war is settled. Now, how conscious they are of that, how conscious they are of the impact of that, and again, I'll go back to 2022 when Russia's war on Ukraine caused a significant downturn in imports in the second half of the year. We will not know the answer to that for some weeks to come, if not months. So processors do need to keep buying. They have some stock, but 5 months isn't a lot when you consider that it's at least 2 months to get the material to the processing plants from West Africa. And there are risks on both sides. There are risks on the supply side, on quality, and there are risks on the demand side due to the potential impact of the war. But apart from the Middle East, we've not seen a hugely negative impact on demand. Yes, we've seen hesitancy, but not really a negative impact so far. What about India? Well, India, major supply at this stage is the crop. Imports are well up on last year. I mean, it is 200,000 tons. That's more than double. It's up 200% on last year at the same time, largely due to additional imports from Tanzania. We should probably just temper that a little bit by saying that India re-exported about 85,000 tons last year. So that the supply situation might be a little bit different. So if we look at the current situation, and I just focus on the columns in the middle, so about a million tons, 1.07 million tons will be needed if demand were to be the same as 2025. So we're talking here about Indian domestic demand and a small amount of export these days. But if demand in India were to be down by 10%, that's significantly reduced. Imports slip back to 862,000 tons. So although it's likely that India will not import the same volume as 2025, it should probably look like 2024. India is a really important factor in demand-wise in determining where the market goes this year. And if India were to have a significant downturn in its demand or in its demand growth even, we would see a knockback effect on what remains left in West Africa at the end of the season. So in India now, the imported stocks from East Africa are beginning to run out. Now the focus is on shipments from West Africa and on high quality. Indian buyers tend to be quality focused. There is a concern on demand in India due to the situation in the economy. The weakness of the Indian rupee to the US dollar does make imports more costly, and that can have an impact on demand as the year goes on. And I think processors certainly need to buy, that's clear. How much they need to buy remains to be seen, but we will not see the answer to that question for some months. But I suspect they will proceed fairly carefully. Raw cashew nut prices in the international market are firm. The market is fairly closely controlled. There's a significant amount of market power in a few hands, so the market slipping away quickly seems unlikely, and therefore processors more than likely will take a careful approach to buying as the season goes on. So overall, there's nothing in Vietnam or in India that would suggest significant volatility in the short term. Our supply side conclusions then. We think the crop is a little bit lower and it's a little bit later, but it's more like a 2024 crop or a 2023 crop in its volume. Inventories and imports of raw cashew nuts are adequate. Inventories and imports of cashew kernels are positive. The crops in Asia, in the big producers, Cambodia and India, still look positive compared to last year, compared to any year. And the risk factors in terms of supply side remain, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, a late and, as usual, a rainy harvest, and the outlook for production in those major producers further west, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, second crop in Guinea, and the start of the harvest in Guinea-Bissau. So nothing particularly pointing to volatility. We are now almost in the month of May. Long harvest, definitely no major shortage emerging. Time to be careful, I think. So let's move on and have a look at our region for today, and we'll have a chat with the guests. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give a brief introduction and then we'll chat to our guests. I'll introduce the historical perspective and then we'll talk to our guests about how they're seeing the situation on the ground today. So we're talking about this area here. You can see on your screen the very westerly area for the production of raw cashew nuts, the end of the Northern Hemisphere harvest in West Africa. It's a complex area. 4 countries in particular are producers of cashew nuts, and the interrelationship between them, the policies in them, is a really interesting subject. Let's have a look at the long-term trend. So first of all, the major producer in the area is Guinea-Bissau. I put in 300,000 tons. That's not forecast for this year. It's just a general average type production. If we look at 2025, you can see Guinea-Bissau is the major producer, followed by Republic of Guinea, followed by Senegal, and Gambia is the smallest producer. About 8.5% of the world's cashews grow in this sub-region. It's experiencing mixed rates of growth. We see strong growth in Guinea, we see strong growth in Senegal, but in the more mature producers, Guinea-Bissau and Gambia, we see slower rates of growth. But it is impressive actually that Guinea-Bissau continues to grow in production, despite the fact that those trees are there many, many years. Generally, as you can see from the chart, steady growth in production, a little bit of volatility, and that's something to look out for. And it'll be interesting to talk to our speakers now to see how they see this year. And the other factor I think that's well worth mentioning is that generally over these 4 countries, we see high quality raw cashew nuts, much favored in the past by Indian processors, and increasingly favored by Vietnamese processors, particularly products from Guinea-Bissau for its high yield. All good news on the production front in the long-term trend. There are significant risks in the region. But if we look at the organization of the sectors, and if we look at the way that this market works, we see several interesting factors. First of all, there's big differences in policy between countries. Some countries have highly regulated sectors, Guinea-Bissau, for example, with high levels of export tax. Others, Senegal and Gambia, up to now, relatively lightly regulated. Guinea, the same bracket, relatively lightly regulated. So there has been a flow of product. Really, logically, it would be dictated by the ports and the quality of the ports. So we have Dakar, we have Banjul, we have Bissau Port, and Conakry, of course. So when we look at these ports and we look at how they impact the flow of product in the region, going back before the introduction of all these taxes, product would naturally flow to the different ports. Today, in Guinea-Bissau, for example, it should flow through the port of Bissau, but there has been a trend towards informal trade cross borders, which you can see with the yellow arrows. So the black arrows are a logical flow of trade, mostly domestic, and then we have a certain amount of informal trade cross-border. So in the region, good production growing at various rates, but low processing volumes still. This mix of regulation systems causes a certain amount of volatility, and we have a mix of older trees and younger trees. So in Guinea-Bissau, we have generally an older tree stock, but it continues to produce younger trees in Guinea and in Senegal and in Gambia, somewhere in between. So it's a really interesting area. Let's come to our guests. And we have John Rao, we have Papa Element Drame, we have Tierno Hamidou Balde, and we have Amrit Kurien. And they're all very welcome. So I'd like to start by coming to John Rao. John, good morning. Are you with us?
Me unmute. Yeah. Morning, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for joining us, John. I understand you're in Conakry this morning.
I'm in Conakry right now, and ironically, Amrit is getting ready to leave for Bissau shortly.
I think that says something about the region, generally speaking, how people move between the different markets.
Yeah.
But John, how are you seeing the situation in Guinea-Bissau? We want to focus, I would like to ask you to focus on Guinea-Bissau. What's your impression of the overall crop upcoming in Guinea-Bissau?
Okay, last week I had done a tour across Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, and I'm currently have been sitting in Conakry for the past 2 or 3 weeks. What I see is definitely in Senegal, we saw a lot more scorched flowers on a lot of the trees. And when I say Senegal, I'm talking about the Casamance region. Kaolack and Sokone, that's different. I haven't been that side, and I hear the crop is down there, but the quality is good. But in the Casamas region, a lot of the bunches of flowers were scorched. And but some of them are bearing fruit, and small quantities have started flowing into Ziguinchor. So it seems a bit early to say if it is a short crop, but it is definitely a delayed crop. That's on the Senegal side. I mean, you come down, you cross the border, you come into Guinea-Bissau. I mean, right from San Domingos to Ingore, and even the eastern side, Gabo, Bafata, and also in the other regions, Bolama and the other regions, you see very good flowering. I saw almost virtually no scorching of flowers. I saw very good fruiting. I mean, from the bunches, you have like 3 or 4 of them turning into fruit from each bunch. And initial unscientific sampling suggests that the quality is also quite good. I mean, 52 plus. Not the same 54, 55 that used to come earlier, but definitely 52 plus right now. So yes, the jury is out, even in Guinea-Bissau, on the quantity issue. Probably the next few weeks will tell us if the quantity is down, but the season is delayed here too.
That's interesting. That seems to be a theme right across West Africa. A later than expected crop. What would be, in Guinea-Bissau specifically, John, what would be the risk factors of a delayed crop?
I think there are not many risk factors. In fact, this year, being the last crop on the northern cycle, has turned out to be a blessing because we see what's happening across the region. I mean, the figures, as shown by you, don't really indicate a much lower crop. But the panic is palpable out here in the region. A lot of traders could not cover the quantities in Ghana, and definitely a lot more traders are landing up in Senegal and in Guinea-Bissau. Senegal, the price war has already started. I mean, in the past day and a half, Amrit would know much more about this. I think prices have gone up by more than 100 CFA. That's more than 150, $160
Wow.
just in a day or two. So this is incredible. Guinea-Bissau has been a bit more restrained. And Senegal, I really hope people take note that they've added a new 32 CFR tax, export tax. That's about $50. So I think people should keep that in mind while doing the calculations. But then cashew traders are cowboys, very optimistic, always ready to take risks.
There's no shortage of risk takers in the cashew business.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I think maybe I mentioned cash flow earlier, so maybe what we're saying is that disappointed buyers in Ghana shift their operations west and end up chasing higher quality products in Senegal right now. What about public policy, John? We know in Guinea-Bissau it's a highly regulated sector. Have we had any announcements yet on the taxation, pricing, and so on?
I think this year we're all breathing a sigh of relief because I think the government, since last year, in fact, not just this year, they've adopted, I think, a very sensible approach to public policy. Last year, in fact, there was a reduction in taxes. This year, there's no change in the tax structure, but they've increased the base for taxation by about $50. It was $1,000 last year. They've raised it to $1,050 this year, which is okay because the euro has strengthened against the dollar. So that compensates for the price rise. And they started asking for applications for the export licenses. I believe the authorities have issued instructions down the line not to harass the trucks coming in from the bush. So yes, we're all very positive about the situation in Guinea-Bissau. The worry, of course, is always the exfiltration, the kind of quantity that goes across the borders to Senegal and to Guinea-Conakry. We saw that already in Guinea-Conakry. Even now, a lot of the goods coming in from Bouquet to Conakry, a lot of them are actually Guinea-Bissau crop. And Senegal remains to be seen what's going to happen.
That was a significant factor last year. It seemed to return big time last year.
I mean, it is last year. I think the export from the ports of Ziguinchor and and Senegal in general, we're about 150,000 tons. Your own estimates indicate about maybe 55 to 70,000 ton local crop. So it's very easy to work out where the rest of the quantity came from.
Yeah, I actually was looking at the import figures with Origin Senegal on them in Vietnam, and it would tend to confirm that. And the port,
Yeah.
Bissau port, how's the situation? Have we seen any significant changes?
Well, they have done 2 rounds of dredging. One was last year, and one was recently this year.
Okay.
The official version is that they've managed to clear up about 2 meters of debris. And I think when our bulk ships start coming in, we can use the sonar to verify really what depth has been dredged. But then any dredging is definitely an improvement. The last time dredging was done, I think, was like 30 or 40 years ago. And so, yes, it is definitely a relief that there has been dredging. But we have the same 2Ks. We're going to have definitely the same kind of congestion as last year. And with the difference that maybe bulk vessels can load in higher quantities at lower tide and don't have to wait just for high tide.
Okay, so dredging means that the port is easier for vessels to fully load or to load more cargo because they've more water, as we call it over here.
Yeah.
And the lack of change. So what we've seen in public policy then is an increase in the base level. So that base is the number used to calculate export taxes, levies, and so on. And that's just up by $50, which is about 5%.
Right.
Okay. So sounds like Guinea-Bissau moving in a positive direction. We hope for a good crop. I'm going to stay with us, John. I want to move on because we have Mr. Papa Element Drame, who's under a little bit of time pressure. So if you would stay with us, John, I'm going to come back to you. Monsieur Drame, bonjour, good morning.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. Let me just remind everyone that interpretation is available on the Zoom call. You can just go and choose your preferred language on that. Mr. Drame, bonjour. What's your view on the production in Senegal this year? How do you see the crop evolving?
Je pense que cette année, quand on fait le tour au niveau de la Casamance, de la région centre au niveau de Sokone, le constat est général. Non seulement il y a un grand retard au niveau de la production, mais aussi on sent que la première production n'est pas bonne du tout partout et que au niveau de certaines fleurs, de façon générale, il y a un assèchement un peu généralisé, à l'exception de la basse Casamance. Donc, ce qui fait craindre que la production sera en baisse cette année 2026.
And what's your feeling on the quality of I know you're a processor, so you understand the quality of raw cashews very well. What's your thoughts on the quality of this crop? Are we looking at a lower quality or are we looking at normal quality in Senegal?
OK. Dans la région centre, nous avons constaté qu'il y a beaucoup de noix vides au niveau de la production. Donc, avec un automne qui descend, même en dessous de 50. Donc, c'est pour dire que le automne au niveau du centre n'est pas bon comme d'habitude. Par contre, au niveau de la région sud, vers Kolda, Sédhiou et récemment Ziguinchor qui est en train de produire. Pour la première position, on a vu que côté qualité, on a un automne correct et il n'y a pas de crainte à ce niveau.
What's the typical raw cashew nut quality in Senegal in terms of the outturn yield and the size of the nuts? What would be in a typical year?
De façon générale, au niveau du Sénégal, nous avons un automne qui est euh, garanti et que on a souvent au niveau de la région qui est frontalier de la Guinée-Bissau vers la Basse-Casamance, des automnes qui font 50 de plus et que au niveau de notre compte, au niveau du sud, nous avons ces dernières années autour de 210, 215, contrairement aux 220 qu'on avait l'habitude de voir. Mais au niveau du centre, nous avons des noix plus grosses où on a en général moins de 200 noix au kilogramme.
Okay, and John Rao mentioned, and I was reading about the changes in export tax, but I also read about some export incentive. And what has the government done? What has the activity been on policy in Senegal for this year?
Pour cette année, côté du gouvernement, nous avons reçu une notification de la douane, des services de la douane, cette semaine. Et on voit bien que la note a été signée le 24 de ce mois, avril, et qui stipule que à partir de maintenant, il y a une taxe, on l'a appelée droit de sortie de 32 francs par kilogramme de noix de cajou exportées. Donc, jusque-là, c'est ce qui est officiel.
And okay, so there is a more active role of the government in the country. Is this bringing more interest in investment in cashew processing? I know you have been a processor for more than 20 years. Are you expanding? Are others coming in to develop processing in Senegal?
En fait, d'après les informations venant de notre ministre du Commerce et de l'Industrie, ils ont signalé que une partie de cette taxe-là sera orientée vers un fonds de développement de la filière cajou et que ça va permettre de développer la production et la transformation. Donc, c'est ce qui a été annoncé par notre ministre du Commerce et de l'Industrie. Mais nous signalons que les acteurs, à travers le plaidoyer de l'ICAS, Interprofession Cajou du Sénégal, avaient introduit une requête au niveau des autorités pour avoir l'autorisation de faire un prélèvement de 20 francs par kilogramme. Donc, le circulaire est au niveau des autorités pour validation et ce fonds sera logé dans un compte dédié et pour servir au développement de la transformation et de la production, en quelque sorte. Voilà. Et que au niveau de la transformation, il y a beaucoup de projets en cours d'installation ici au Sénégal. Et nous aussi, au niveau de la ACPL, nous avons un plan de développement pour vraiment augmenter les niveaux de transformation et qui est vraiment constaté très faible au niveau du pays.
Thank you very much indeed. I know that you have a stakeholder meeting coming up, so I'll finish there. I'd just like to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Papa Eliman Drame, the founder of SCPL Processor in Senegal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Je vous en prie.
Interesting thoughts on Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. So let's move to our contributor from Guinea. Tierno Hamidou Balde he's the executive secretary of the Cashew Interprovision, as well as a business person in his own right. Mr. Balde, how is the crop in Guinea progressing?
Oui, je vous reçois. Hmm. Oui, je suis à vous. Je ne vous entends pas, hein. Si vous-
Okay, well, good morning to you and thank you for joining us. I've introduced you as the executive secretary of the Cashew Interprofession, as well as a business person in your own right. And my first question is, how is the crop in Guinea progressing this year?
Bon, la saison en Guinée, comme vous le remarquerez déjà, euh, elle est en train d'évoluer malgré qu'il y ait des petites difficultés en matière de qualité, mais dû un peu à une précipitation des producteurs pour pouvoir liquider le produit, puisqu'on assiste ces derniers jours-là à une baisse du prix. Donc, ce qui pousse certains producteurs à anticiper à ne pas trop, comment on appelle ça, faire cesser le produit, notamment dans la zone de Cancan, pour pouvoir commercialiser. Ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, dans cette région, on assiste à une baisse un peu significative de la qualité. Mais au niveau de l'interprofession, nous sommes en train de prendre des dispositions actuellement pour mieux sensibiliser les producteurs là pour qu'ils puissent suivre le cycle complet du séchage pour que les produits continuent à garder leur qualité. Donc, dans la zone de Bokeh, la qualité, dans la grande région de Bokeh, la qualité, elle est stable. Nous sommes à peu près avec 48 autochtones à Bokeh contre 42 à Cancan et on a rarement du 43 et du 44 à Cancan. Donc, les autres régions, notamment Farana et Kindia, sont en train, comment on appelle ça, d'augmenter en termes de quantité de production, puisque c'est des nouvelles zones de production, puisque naturellement, nous avons Cancan et Bokeh. Et la région de Kindia, la région de Farana, où les plantations sont nouvelles, la production elle est croissante, ce qui fait que, en plus de l'historique qu'on a depuis 10 ans, ou ces 5 dernières années, nous avons aujourd'hui des opportunités d'avoir des quantités dans ces nouvelles zones de production qui sont en train d'émerger. Je sais pas si vous m'entendez, moi je vous entends pas, hein.
We can hear you very well, and thank you for those comments. Do we know how much raw cashew nuts have been exported so far this year?
Non, cette année, non, puisque au niveau des statistiques locales, l'agence qui s'occupait de l'export de l'anacarde a été dissous, qui était l'agence guinéenne de promotion des exportations. Une nouvelle agence a été créée qu'on appelle Guinea Development Board, qui englobe les investissements et les exportations. Donc, nous sommes en discussion avec eux. Pas plus tard que ce matin, nous avons discuté avec le management pour pouvoir continuer à obtenir les données. Mais puisque c'est une nouvelle agence, il n'y a que le top management qui est nommé. Les autres structures à la base sont en train d'être mises en place. Donc, ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, nous ne sommes pas en mesure de fournir des informations sur les statistiques à l'export, malgré que l'export se passe dans les meilleures conditions. Mais nous n'avons pas accès aux données, mais c'est une situation qui va certainement entrer en ordre dans 1 ou 2 semaines.
That's understood. Thank you. I hope we can maybe get access to that data for the next event in 2 weeks. What about the situation in processing in Guinea? There were some cashew factories operational. Are they still operational?
Mhm. Oui, oui, il y a des unités de transformation qui existent. Il y en a qui sont en cours de construction. La plus ancienne et opérationnelle, c'est celle de Cancan, mais elle est en cours d'extension. Elle était à 10 000 tonnes. Ils sont en train de la faire passer à 20 000 tonnes. Donc, dans peut-être 3 ou 4 mois, l'usine va être opérationnelle avec ses nouvelles capacités de 20 000 tonnes. Mais dans la région de Bokeh et Kindia, il y a des nouvelles unités. Il y a une grande, c'est la même compagnie, Diaoné Agro, qui est en train de faire une nouvelle usine à Bokeh aussi. Et les travaux ont avancé. Peut-être que dans 2 ou 3 mois, ils vont reprendre, poursuivre les activités. Le hangar principal de 4 000 mètres carrés est déjà construit. La clôture est faite. Il y a beaucoup d'équipements qui sont déjà arrivés à Conakry. Puisque l'année dernière, à cause de la congestion du port, il y a eu assez de retard. Donc, il y a une autre compagnie qui est en train de faire une autre unité de 3 500 tonnes, toujours dans la zone de Bokeh. Et à celle-là, il faut ajouter des petites unités qui émergent, notamment aussi à comment on appelle ça, à Bokeh, à Kindia. Mais les capacités ne sont pas aussi importantes. Donc, il n'y a que ces 3 grandes unités, celle de Cancan qui va passer à 20 000 tonnes, celle de Bokeh qui va être aussi à 20 000 tonnes de la même compagnie, et une unité qui est en cours de construction qui est à 3 500 tonnes. Maintenant, il y a des petites unités autour et la politique réellement, les discussions sont en cours avec cette nouvelle agence. Nous avons eu des réunions pour pouvoir et créer les conditions du développement de la transformation locale en mettant à disposition des fonds ou des faciliter, pour appuyer les investissements existants, renforcer les investissements existants et donner le goût à certains investisseurs de pouvoir engager de nouveaux projets en Guinée.
Very interesting indeed. Just to finish then, what's your view on the long-term outlook for production of cashew nuts, or the growing and production of cashew nuts in Guinea? Are we looking at long-term growth, or what's the situation in your view over the next 5 to 10 years, let's say?
Bon, nous sommes en train de nous projeter sur une croissance, mais surtout une amélioration de la qualité, puisque déjà à la base, l'interprofession dont je suis le secrétaire exécutif dispose d'un plan stratégique quinquennal qui a mis assez d'actions sur la recherche et le développement. Et actuellement, nous avons un réseau national de formateurs animé à travers des groupes WhatsApp. Donc, chaque zone de production dispose de son groupe WhatsApp où les innovations, les bonnes pratiques sont diffusées auprès de centaines de producteurs. Et les semences améliorées. Donc, l'idée, dans notre logique de développement, on veut faire des parcs à bois pour renforcer les vergers existants, mais aussi créer de nouvelles plantations avec des semences certifiées. Donc, actuellement, et au niveau du Conseil international consultatif du Cashew, nous siégeons là-bas. Donc, la commission scientifique dispose déjà d'un programme dans ce sens et nous sommes en train de mettre en place au niveau de chaque préfecture des pépinières avec des semences certifiées, mais aussi des parcs à bois avec des arbres polycloniaux pour pouvoir corriger les vergers existants. Donc, tout cet ensemble euh, d'éléments vont venir impulser une production tout en améliorant la qualité. Donc, nous sommes projetés dans ce sens-là, c'est d'aller vraiment vers une production importante, mais aussi une valorisation locale, notamment des noix, de la pomme. Nous sommes en train d'expérimenter la valorisation de la pomme et aussi la valorisation des coques en CNSL. Donc ça, c'est des planifications de l'interprofession qui sont en train d'être appuyées par différents acteurs au niveau du pays pour faire avancer la filière au niveau local.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you. So please stay with us. We've got some very interesting comments, but I'm sure there may be some questions too. So please stay with us and we will come back to you in due course. So moving on then to Amrit Kurian. And Amrit, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Just starting with Gambia, how do you see the situation this year and in recent years in Gambia for the cashew sector?
Yeah, good morning, Jim, and good morning, everybody. So just wanted to say that I'll be leaving shortly on a trip which not many people make, where you could have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner in 3 different countries. So we keep joking that, you could have your breakfast in Gambia and then have your lunch in Senegal. And then I was hoping John would host me for a dinner. And interestingly enough, these 3 countries are one is an Anglophone country, one is a Francophone country, and one is a Lusophone country. So not many places where you could do this. Coming to the crop, honestly speaking, Gambia is too small a place to make much of a difference. But what we are seeing here is a delay of around 3 weeks. And generally, when I speak to the people around, they're all talking about a 10 to 15% crop delayed or a short crop. Not very sure. Normally, they say when it is delayed, it is short. But the tax that has been announced last week is going to have some effect on this region. It's going to really help Guinea-Bissau, because the cashew that gets crossed over is because Senegal can offer a higher price. That would be challenged because Senegal itself has fixed a 32 CFA tax. So the crop flowing into Senegal, I feel would be lesser. But what could be interesting is the crop flowing into Gambia could also increase, because Gambia doesn't have the tax. So we could have the crop moving from Senegal to Gambia more than normal. So those are the things that I see that stand out. Otherwise, Gambia is a very small place. I mean, we don't produce more than crop size. I saw you put around 10 to 12,000. I think you would be right. But we do export at least anything between 25 to 30,000 tons, and most of it is coming from across the border. So yeah, I would put this year maybe we would export maybe around 20,000 tons, which would be perhaps around 5 to 7,000 tons lower than last year. But then the tax could be something interesting. It's something which is still unfolding. A lot of people don't know how it's going to happen. Is it something that's just going to happen at the port level, or is it going to happen at the border level where you could just pay tax and bring it across? So those are things that we would know perhaps in the coming few weeks. So yeah, that's what it is about Gambia.
That's interesting. I've done that 3 countries in the opposite way: breakfast in Bissau, dinner in Banjul, and it's quite an interesting trip. But what really comes across is the difference over the years in policy and management of the cashew sectors in the 3 countries, and how that's influenced cross-border trade. People have often spoken about the need for some form of policy harmonization across the region. We saw the LIFT project, for example, write extensively on that. Is there any prospect of policy harmonization in terms of export taxation across the countries in the sub-region, Amrit?
I'm still not. I had this talk with the Incalo guys, and there was a push actually for the taxation in Senegal to be at a much higher level, meaning they were talking of around 60 CFA or something more, and they divided it into two parts of it. I think 30 CFA and another 30 sefa for the processing. I still don't know. I don't think many people know how this is going to be, how this is going to help the processing. Because as I see, for one to process, one would, I mean, in the sense that Ivory Coast has been a successful story because they've got the production, and they had the government throwing their weight behind that by providing subsidies and really promoting. They really had a vision to it. But for other countries to follow suit, really, I don't know how sensible it is, keeping in mind the productions that we're talking about. So coming to the harmonization of policies, I am not very sure of how that is, because most of the governments do make a lot of money out of this. Like Guinea-Bissau's one of the biggest earning is the tax. And they're very clear that they don't want to have this tax even paid at the border so that they could bring it across legally to Senegal. They're very clear. They want this all to be exported via the port. So harmonization is, I think, a distant thing currently. And there's one more thing that one has to keep in mind that, I mean, why I was telling you about processing being a difficult thing, at least in these regions, is, I mean, to move just between Gambia and Senegal or Senegal and Bissau, let's say a ton of cash. I mean, it's much cheaper to move it to Vietnam and India. The freight rates are sometimes just $20 or even $15 or even a negative rate. But to move it just 100, 200 kilometers, you would be paying much higher here. So, so regarding the harmonization of tax, really, I think we're too early, at least for this region.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. But it is interesting how, like, if you think of the logistics, if you were growing cashews in Bissau close to the Senegal border, if there were no tax differences, if you could have free movement of the product, you might well choose to move it to Banjul for export. So the logistical pressures maybe don't match with the policies. And it seems to me that it's a little bit of I don't think that situation will change. But I also appreciate the point you make about the volume and processing. One of the things in Cote d'Ivoire, one of the aspects of success is that you can have a big raw cashew nut export business and a processing business because you're producing over 1 million tons a year. And a lot of the investors in processing are also people who have been heavily invested and heavily active in the trading of raw cashew nuts. So you can run both things with that volume. Perhaps the volume isn't there in the sub-region, certainly not in Gambia, for those activities. So, Amrit, how do you see this season unfolding in terms of the raw cashew nut market? We've heard delayed crops. We've heard maybe positive from John on Guinea-Bissau, neutral to positive on Guinea. How do you see the season evolving? Are buyers coming in? Are they standing back? How's that market working for now?
There's a lot of excitement because, if you look at if you look at the crop, broadly speaking, you can divide it into the under 50s and the plus 50 outturn regions. So Segabi would be the first place where you would be able to get your, consistent 50 plus outturns. And with Bissau always exports being a challenge, and Senegal with the tax and the delay, the only place where you could actually buy and export would be Gambia. So there is some demand. The people who I speak to, including myself, are like almost 40% behind on year when you do a comparison. Now, is it because there are too many players, or is there a delay in crop, or is there a crop problem? Really, it's tough to understand that. But surely the crop is delayed. There's still flowers, like what John said. Some of them are not even coming out. But I'm sure all of this is, you just look at a few trees. I still had a supplier of mine who had a cashew tree in his house, and he would look at the cashew tree, and If it gave good flowers and good nuts, he would say it's a bumper crop, Amrit. And if it wasn't giving enough, so he would say it's a short crop. So there's a lot of confirmation bias going around. So really, I don't know. But one thing for sure is the crop is delayed. That there's no doubt about it.
Okay. Okay. That's really interesting. Thanks, Amrit. That's very interesting.